Okay, so we have a few more identities left in this lesson. I'd like you to try these on your own before watching me do them. So pause the video. Okay, now that you're back, if you look at the left side, it looks more complicated. We can just multiply those two binomials. And if I simplify that, I end up with 1 minus sine squared, which you should recognize as cos squared. Okay, now look at the right side. It's 1 over secant squared. Well, we know by definition that secant is 1 over cos. Okay, so cosine squared is 1 over secant squared. If you're not sure about that, remember that secant squared is 1 over cos, so you have 1 over cos, and if you do the inverse and multiply, you're going to end up with cos squared. Okay? Let's try this next one. Okay, so you have cosine, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply into that binomial. So I'm going to multiply into that binomial, but I'm going to write the binomial in terms of sine and cos. So tan is sine over cos, and cotan is cos over sine. By the way, even if you have no idea where you're going, just doing this will get you 1 mark. You've shown you know 2 identities. Okay, now if I multiply this into here, I get cos sine over cos plus cos squared over sine. Okay, and before I go any further, I see those coses will cancel. And so I have sine plus cos squared over sine. So what I want to do is I want to make this denominator the same. So instead of being over 1, so changing the denominator to sine means I'm multiplying the denominator by sine. I need to multiply the numerator by sine. So now, if you look at the numerator, sine squared plus cos squared, 1 over sine, and that's exactly what you wanted to end up with. Okay, what are we going to do with this one? Well, let's begin by changing cosecant and secant using the identity there. So sine would become 1 over sine like that. Sorry, cosecant is 1 over sine. And secant is 1 over cos. So what is sine divided by 1 divided by sine? Sine divided by 1 over sine. This is the same as sine times sine. So this becomes sine squared. And this becomes cos squared, which equals 1. Okay, let's try the next one. Okay, looking at this one, I see the subtraction. That makes it a more complicated question than the multiplication. So let's work on the left side. What am I going to do on the left side? Well, how am I going to get to this? Well, I'm going to start by giving it a common denominator. Before I can do that, I need to change to all sine. So I'm going to go 1 over sine minus sine. And if I need common denominators, the common denominator is going to be sine. So this becomes sine squared. Okay, so that tells me what to do. I have 1 minus sine squared over sine. And where do I want to end up? I want to end up with cotan. Now, if you remember what cotan is, that's cos over sine. So I need some coses in there. Maybe you recognize that the numerator is actually cos squared. Well, that's pretty close to what I need. Let me try to write it like this, see if it makes more sense to you then. If I write it like that, this is cotan times cosine. Okay, so we're done some of the identities for now. I want to go and do some of these equation questions. So this is revisiting what the first 3 lessons were using identities. So let's scroll back a couple pages here where I left a couple blanks. Okay, that was on the previous lesson, so right here. It says use algebra to solve. Solve means we're going to come up with an answer. Okay, now the problem is I see 2 different trig ratios, and this is where we're going to use our identities. So now we're going to do trig equations, and we're going to throw in some identities. So I know that I can change cosecant to sine. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write 2 sine x equals 3 plus 2 times 1 over sine. Okay, let's just clean that up a little bit. This is 2 over sine. And now I don't like the denominator. I don't like the fractions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply everything by sine x. So I need to put this into each one of these terms. So what happens? Well, the first one becomes 2 sine squared. This becomes 3 sine. And here the sines cancel, leaves me with 2. So let's bring everything to one side of the equation. Let's factor. And this should look familiar now. So here we have sine x equals -1/2. That'll be here and here. The reference angle, where is sine equal to 1/2? Well, we're in radians. That's at pi by 6. Here you're going to get sine x is 2. That won't work. So my angles are 7 pi by 6 and 11 pi by 6. Okay. So just a couple of comments about that question. If you don't get this right, if you don't substitute this right, usually that's a mark. It's a full mark. Okay, the problem is if you don't substitute it correctly, you're not going to be able to factor correctly later on. So basically this question would kind of be like, well, here's 1 mark, and then all the way to where it's factored, that's another mark, and then solving is going to be the 3rd mark. So if you get stuck in one place, you know, make up factors. Keep going, see if you can come up with some sort of an answer. Okay? Last one, I'm going to show this one to you only because if I don't show it to you, you'll never know what to do in this case. I mean, you could guess and check, where is sine equal to cosine? You know that's at pi by 4. At pi by 4, sine and cos are equal. But if I want to solve this algebraically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide both sides by cosine. This gives me sine over cos equals 1. And sine over cos is tan. So now I know I'm here and here, and the reference angle is pi by 4, which is what I just mentioned. So we have pi by 4 and 5 pi by 4. Okay, so that's a trick. If you see sine equals cos, if you divide by the same thing, you end up with just one ratio, just tan. it's hard to solve questions with two trig ratios. We want to get to the place where there's only one ratio. Okay, so there's a couple, and then there's one more in this lesson we just completed. So let's go to that. Okay, here it is. This is more common. So you see we have a sine and we have a cos. We need to change one of them. Now, remember this, we have a trig ratio for sine squared. That's 1 minus cos squared. Do we have one for sine? We do not. So you can only change sine to cos where there is a squared term. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave this. And where sine is, I'm going to write 1 minus cos squared. Okay, now you can see I have a trig equation with only cos in it. So let me clean this up. We'll collect like terms here. And then I'm going to rearrange it. And factor it. So, cos x is a half, cos x is 1. This will happen here and here with a reference angle of pi by 3. Cos x will be 1. Here the reference angle is 0. So my answers will be pi by 3, 5 pi by 3, 0, and 2 pi. Okay, knowing that my answer was supposed to be between 0 and 2 pi. Okay, so you try this one now that you know what you have to do. Are you going to substitute for here or for here? Well, cos squared is 1 minus sine squared. So I get 2 minus 2 sine squared minus 3 sine. I'm going to rearrange the order. And then I don't like the negative to factor, so I'm going to divide everything by -1. So I get 2 sine squared plus 3 sine squared minus 2 is 0. And I should be able to factor this. 2 sine and sine. I think I'll put plus 2 minus 1. If you're not sure about this, now quick comment about this, you can check by foiling. If you factor incorrectly, that's only 1 mark. If these two factors were completely wrong and you solved correctly from there, you're still going to get marks. So don't give up even if you make a mistake. Okay, but assuming you've done this correctly, you would get this. This one doesn't go. Sine is positive. And the reference angle will be pi by 6. So x is pi by 6, 5 pi by 6. Okay, last one before we move on to a new unit. Similar question here, but now you don't have sine and cos. Is there a way you can change tan squared to secant? Okay, I think we have tan squared plus 1 equals secant squared. I believe that's one of our identities. So I can write 2 times secant squared minus 1 plus secant plus 1 equals 0. Did you see what I had to do there? I had to take this 1 to the other side to get tan by itself. So I get 2 secant squared minus 2 plus secant plus 1 is 0. Rearranging. And then factoring. Now you'll notice I go fairly fast at the end here. Okay, I expect that you should try these on your own first. Okay, so this means secant is a half, and if secant's a half, that means cosine is 2. Doesn't work. Here, secant is negative 1, which means cosine is negative 1. And that happens here. So theta is pi. Okay, what's your homework? Well, I've got a textbook question. You could try to finish the identities, although there's a few in there that I wouldn't worry too much about. And then on our trig equations worksheet, you've done 7.1, 7.2, 7.3. Go do 7.4. There's just a few examples there. Okay, so that's a pretty large homework assignment. Make sure you get it done.